Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the Harvard Center for International Development's Friday Speaker Series. My name is Berta, and I'm a program assistant at CID. Here at CID, our mission is to build a thriving world for all. We work across the university and a global network of researchers and practitioners to build an international pool of talent, convene academic and practitioner networks, and deploy breakthrough research to address the world's most pressing challenges. It's why we are so excited about today's conversation on the past, present, and future of development finance. Before we get started, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. Please enjoy lunch, but help us keep the planet safe by doing your part. All food items, including cups, napkins, and utensils, are compostable. Hold questions until the Q&A, where a mic will be available and passed around. Today's session is being recorded, focusing on the speaker, with the video to be available on the CID YouTube channel. If you prefer not to be photographed for CID social media, inform a team member, please. Use the QR codes to check in, helping us track attendance to plan and improve our future events. And subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram to stay connected. Without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers for today. And that's Wasim Tahir. He's a research fellow at Harvard University's Center for International Development, where his work focuses on the mobilization of private capital towards sustainable development initiatives. In addition to his research, he leads development finance programming for students, serves as a senior advisor to the Center for Development Finance Studies, and as advisor to ODI Global Advisory, the consulting arm of the UK-based think tank ODI. Prior to Harvard, Wasim spent several years at British International Investment, the UK's DFI, and at Boston Consulting Group. And then we have Nick O'Donohoe, who recently concluded his term as Chief Executive Officer of British International Investment, BII, the UK's development finance institution and one of the largest bilateral DFIs globally. During his leadership, BII invested over $10 billion across Africa and Asia, expanding significantly in size and scope, and becoming a leading provider of UK climate finance. So, please welcome.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody. Welcome everybody in the room. Welcome to all of you who are online. It's from a personal perspective, it's a real pleasure. I'm now a senior fellow at the Mosfer Rahmani Center for Business and Government here in the Kennedy School. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to so many students, to work with also with the Center for International Development. And it's hopefully, I think, the size of the number of people in the room and the number of people online is indicative of the interest in development finance. And I think that's appropriate because particularly in the environment that we're in now, as I'll talk about later, development finance is becoming increasingly important as a way of providing support, development support for many countries around the world. I wanted to start with just a quick, just to sort of level set everybody, a quick definition of development finance, because, you know, I think at a high level, everybody understands what development finance means. It means the provision of financial resources with the aim of promoting growth, alleviating poverty, creating jobs. It differs from commercial finance in the sense that commercial finance, when we talk about commercial finance, we're talking about investors who are typically seeking to maximize some sort of risk-adjusted return, whereas on the development finance side, we're talking about investors whose primary aim is directed at creating these impact benefits in infrastructure or health or education or jobs or whatever. And development finance comes in many forms. It can be domestic. It doesn't have to be internationally focused. It can be domestically focused. One of the largest development banks in the world, KfW in Germany, started in 1948 with a mission of providing finance into the reconstruction of Germany. But I think when we talk about development finance, and I suspect the reason most of you are here today, when we talk about development finance today, we normally mean providing financial resources to emerging markets and developing economies. Now, we can do that in a whole lot of different ways. We can do it through grants, we can do it through concessionary loans, we can do it through closer to market loans, we can do it through equity. Sometimes we can, the money will be repaid and earn a return. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's provided by multilateral institutions such as the World Bank or the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank. Sometimes it's provided by bilateral institutions like British International Investment, the organization that I ran for almost 8 years. But most importantly, and the most important distinction I want to make here, because it's critical in understanding what we're going to talk about in the next 50 minutes or so, development finance can be provided to governments or it can be provided to private companies. And so so it can be used, so the counterparty of the development finance institution can be a government or it can be a private company. And that's a crucial distinction. Much of what the multilateral development banks do, what the World Bank does, what most of the large regional development banks do, is dominated by sovereign lending and sovereign support. Whereas when we talk about development finance institutions and the institutions we're going to talk about today, we're talking about companies or investment institutions whose mandate is to support and provide capital to private companies. So that's hopefully some of you will have known that already, but just to level set everybody, that's where we're coming from here. The history of development finance really started in the 1940s. It started with Bretton Woods. It started with the creation of the World Bank and the creation of the IMF. It started at a time of enormous post-war reconstruction, particularly in Europe. It started at the time of the Marshall Plan, which wasn't specifically an example of development finance, but I think acted as sort of a model for much of what was done, particularly subsequently by the World Bank. But most of what was being done at that time, or almost all of what was being done at that time, was focused on channeling money through governments to try to support reconstruction. But in 1948, the UK government decided that they wanted to do something a little bit different. Rather, at the time, of course, the UK had an empire. It had colonies around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia. I think they recognized those colonies had suffered through the war as the UK itself had. I think the government in Britain recognized the need for some sort of support for reconstruction. I think part of that was probably altruistic, to be fair, to give them some credit. But I think most importantly, it was also because these colonies were a source of raw materials and a critical part of the UK industry's supply chain. So in order to do that, they had a novel idea and they founded an organization which was known as the Colonial Development Corporation, or CDC. And that was the world's first development finance institution. And the idea was that they would provide capital and capacity support to countries in the colonies to help them grow the private sector. And Lord Reith, some of you will know, was the first chairman of the BBC. He was also the first chairman of CDC in 1948. And when he was asked what this institution is for, he said it was to do good without losing money. And so, in other words, it's an investment institution. We want to do good things. We wanted to create, what we call now a positive development impact, but we wanted it to be sustainable. We don't want it to lose money. And to some extent, that has been the model since 1948 for all the development finance institutions. And you can see on the slide, it is in 1956, the World Bank decided, having been exclusively focused on sovereign lending, decided that they also wanted to support the private sector. So that's why they formed the IFC. The IFC today is obviously the largest multilateral development finance institution in the world. Other countries, in the same way that the UK set up a bilateral organization called CDC, also started setting up development finance institutions to focus on the private sector. So DEG, for example, DEG is a subsidiary of KfW. KfW is Germany's development bank. So it was relatively easy for them to, having had the success that they'd had with KfW in the 50s, to transition in the early 60s and create within it an organization called DEG to focus on emerging economies in the private sector. so that's how the whole sort of ecosystem of development finance grew over time. The multilateral development banks, starting with the World Bank and the creation of IFC, the large regional development banks today, African Development Bank, ADB, IADB, all have very large, EBRD, all have very large private sector focused investment organizations that run alongside their traditional sovereign sovereign lending. So that really was the roots, and I suppose it left somewhat of a legacy, which Wasim is going to touch on.
Yeah, no, exactly. Just to make it tangible for you all, and for myself, when I joined BII, one of the things that I did was to kind of look back at some of the old annual reports that they have. And what you have here on screen is an extract from the annual accounts of 1956. And towards the back of it, it shows the different regions where they had investments. And one of the ones that I wanted to highlight to you is Chilanga Cement Company. So this was actually an investment that the Colonial Development Corporation made back then in Rhodesia in 1949. And what's impressive is it still exists today. It was actually the first company to be listed on the Zambia Stock Exchange in 1995, and it was a major supplier of cement to quite a major dam that was constructed in 1959. So that was that. Another organizational company I like to talk about is I worked in Singapore in 2018, and if anyone else has been to Singapore, what you'll notice is their kind of main big bank, where they have branches everywhere, is DBS Bank. It's kind of like the Wells Fargo of Singapore. And when I joined BII, what was interesting is I came across DBS Bank mentioned in some of the kind of old literature that the organization had, and DBS turns out stands for Development Bank of Singapore. And it was actually a financial intermediary that was set up by CDC Group to channel funding into economic development, into the economic development of Singapore. So there's quite a few notable examples, of the legacy of development finance. If you look at IFC, there'll be many examples as well. Nick, I mean, from your time, are there any kind of examples that come to your mind?
Yeah, I think when you look at the history and it's of what was of CDC, the Colonial Development Corporation became the Commonwealth Development Corporation in around the early 1960s, when countries were becoming independent and the sort of empire was breaking apart. But there were a lot of stories about how post-independence in many of these countries, CDC stayed involved. The Kenya Tea Development Authority is an example of that, where you had a large group of fragmented tea farmers in Kenya. CDC provided capital. They helped to build factories. They provided technical assistance, and they allowed Kenya to go from being, as I said, very fragmented, based purely on smallholder farmers, to being one of the largest exporters of tea in the world. And that was an example of supporting effectively the creation of a large cooperative. I think the biggest Chilanga Cement, there were really three areas where organizations like CDC were focused. One was infrastructure, and we talked about the Kariba Dam. We didn't own the Kariba Dam, but we did it needed a lot of cement, and we built the cement factories to supply the cement to Kariba. And as Wasim says, that's still providing power today. It also, by the way, dislocated 35,000 people. It was one of the largest dislocations of any hydro project in the world, certainly up to that point. So it wasn't as with many of these projects, there were issues, and I think the way that development institutions do them has changed a lot since the 1960s. But
on that point, just because I think especially when we're there working at BII and development finance institutions, we're kind of always putting on the kind of rosy picture of what development finance is and its impact and legacy. Given the audience here, given we're in an academic environment, right? What is the negative? What's the negative legacy? What's been the bad stuff that's happened as well, right? Because it can't all have been good.
Yeah, look, I think there is, as Wasim said, that not every investment works out, and that's true whether you're a fully fledged commercial organization or a development finance institution. I think within a DFI, some of our investments don't work because they don't work financially. And if we don't, the whole basis of the model of development finance and DFIs is that you recycle the money. So you are expected to earn a return. Doesn't mean every investment earns a return. But also because we're development investors, not every investment creates the sort of development impact that we would like and hope that the investments would have. I think if you look back into the very, very early history of what was then CDC, one of the first large investments they made was in trying to develop groundnuts in Tanzania. Groundnuts, I think, is what in the US we call peanuts. And the reason that they wanted to do that was because they wanted to find a consistent, steady supply of particularly vegetable oils into the UK. But they had groundnuts had never been grown in Tanzania. The soil was the wrong soil. There was no infrastructure. There was no experience. And I think that almost actually brought down the whole organization within a couple of years of its creation. And I think there is a lot of cases of sort of some partially over optimism, where you think, well, because the climate looks this way, you could create a wonderful groundnut farming industry in a country like Tanzania. Some of it is political, because obviously the countries in which we invested in are all subject to significant political risk. You get changes in government, which can take a project and sometimes nationalize it or whatever. I think generally, particularly in the early days, there was sort of a misunderstanding of the complexity of some of the local community factors, some of the environmental factors. Many of we had a famous farm in Zambia called Mapongwe, which I've been to, and it's got some of the richest agricultural land in the world. But it was created in the 1970s without any real regard for the community that surrounded it and the ownership of the land within it. So these sort of things, I think, regularly happened. And I wouldn't say that, I think we've gotten a lot better, and we've certainly got a lot more diligent in terms of understanding the social and environmental factors. We're much more local, in the sense the people that work for us in these countries are local people. We don't operate businesses anymore. Originally, the role of the DFI, and it was not only to put money in, it was also to go down and run the company. So if you go to this farm in Zambia, they'll show you the house where the guy from CDC used to live while he was running the thing. So we don't do any of that anymore. But when I took over as the chief executive of BII in what was then CDC in 2017, we turned out we had a couple of real turkeys in our portfolio. We had a cement factory in Kenya that we'd invested a lot of money in, and it went bankrupt. We had a palm oil plantation right in the center of the DRC, probably the most remote place I've ever been to. Incredible from a job creation perspective, given there's no formal employment at all, and this company was employing 7,000 or 8,000, and it had rescued a plantation that Unilever had developed 100 years before. But again, from a financial perspective, was a very difficult investment. So there's lots of good stories, but there's lots of difficult ones as well.
Just to kind of bring it more to the present or near past, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my journey to development finance. And I was working in the world of financial services, and I was working in a bank, and at the time, what I knew was that I wanted to find something a bit more meaningful, but also not fully divorced from my field of financial services. And at the time, it was about 2011, 2012. One of the papers that I came across that was kind of really impactful, right, and kind of really made me realize that impact investing in development finance is the field that I want to look into more and try and get into, was the paper by JP Morgan called Impact Investments in Emerging Asset Class. It was a seminal paper at the time that really put a label on this emerging asset class of investing for impact in emerging markets. And that paper, it turns out, was actually authored by Nick in his role as Global Head of Research at JP Morgan. So Nick, can you talk a bit more about, this report, what kind of new insights it brought forward, why it was such a timely kind of contribution to the field? And you can scan it, by the way, if you want to access it.
Yeah, well, it's nice to know that it had such a big impact on Wasim's career, but it's yeah, I think this report came out of, I was fortunate enough when I was at JP Morgan, I was the global head of research at the time, but I also got asked to supervise a group, a very small group that the bank decided to set up called the Social Sector Finance Group. And that was how I got involved in this world of what was then emerging as impact investment. It was also the time of the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. And I think those two things sort of coincided quite fortuitously in the sense that I think the financial crisis demonstrated to people just how much impact on ordinary people's lives the choices that we make around investment and the consequences of our investment are. And at the same time, a group really led by the Rockefeller Foundation was trying to bring together this idea that we should be pay more attention to those to the impact of our investments. So I was lucky enough to be at one of the meetings in which the Rockefeller Foundation organized, in where they really christened the term impact investment. And when they went around the table and they said, look, it was 20 people there, they said, you've all got to come up with something you can do to sort of stimulate this investment as the growth of this field. And so when it came to me, I said, well, JP Morgan, I'm the head of research there, we have 1 million people on our mailing list, which at the time I think was believed to be true. And so we'll write a research report and we'll call it impact investing. We'll send it to 1 million people, investors. And that was quite, it was the first time any organization, and we did that together with the Rockefeller Foundation, and with also some help from from GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. But it was the first time that the term impact investment was ever used by a mainstream financial firm. And I think it did tie in quite neatly with the whole field of development finance, because obviously there had been, the IFC and BII, CDC had been around for many years. They didn't necessarily accept that they were impact investors. In fact, if you look at that report, you'll find when we did this data work with GIN, the IFC did refuse to contribute because the word impact investment at the time sort of connoted more grant making and highly concessionary finance, and they didn't at the time want to be associated with that. And then they subsequently, of course, became very much a leader in promoting the idea of impact investment. But I think the value of that, of the rise of the impact investment movement, and it is still extraordinary to think in 2008, 2009, we sort of christened the term, and then you have now everybody knows what impact investment is. But it did, I think, focus on, it increased the diligence and the rigor around how we measured impact, which frankly, people were not doing before. And it also focused attention on the potential for investment and for creating tangible impact and intentional impact from your investments. So I think that was one of the reasons why, as impact investment grew, the attention on development finance and what people like the IFC and CDC were doing also grew.
Yeah. And just to kind of illustrate that growth, I joined BII in 2018, and when I left, the organization tripled in size. It was astounding how quickly it grew. And there's a chart here on screen that shows you the percentage change in their assets under management, and it's a field that's grown substantially over the last 20 years. I think a big part of it, or the kickoff for the growth in the field, was the financial crisis. And what governments realized is that when markets froze, it was DFIs that were still lending and still investing. They were acting countercyclically, and so it became so governments realized that, hang on, we should actually cherish these institutions. We should maybe try and think about capitalizing them some more, and increasing their role in the development landscape. And so, I mean, Nick, you can talk a bit more about kind of that growth and how BII started getting some more capitalized from the government.
Yeah. So I think the key drivers of growth in development finance, as we know it, post the financial crisis, were, first of all, COP at Copenhagen in 2009, which is the first time that governments really identified their responsibility to provide funding to support climate transition in emerging markets. And that was the time they committed to the $100 billion that they were going to be providing by 2020. I think when the governments then post Copenhagen, when they looked around for how they were going to do that in practice, they sort of alighted quite naturally on their bilateral development finance institutions, because we know these investment institutions, number one, and 80% of the money to support climate transition is going to have to come from the private sector. So that was we obviously knew these countries. And we've been investing in them for a long time. So it was very natural that they would, rather than set up a whole new climate institution, that they would bilaterally, they would use their bilateral organization. So that was a big piece and as we said in the introduction, BII became the principal provider of climate finance by the UK government over the time that I was there. But there were also other, I mean, we had the Addis conference in 2016 on financing for development, which again, that was when we talked about billions to trillions, and clearly identified again private finance as being playing a critical role. I think we have also, during that period of time, we had we had the significant investment by the Chinese, particularly in Africa and Asia, and I think there was a sense that we needed to, the government sense that we needed to respond to that. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot going on in innovation and in things like blended finance, in digital finance. So there are a lot of things that were happening that all pointed in the same direction, which was we need growth in the private sector needs to be a much more central to our development policy, and therefore our DFIs need to be much more bigger and more flexible.
And it's not just the existing DFIs that have expanded. We've seen recently new DFIs form as well. Only 6 years ago did Canada introduce their own development finance institution, again modeled on the typical bilateral DFI. They're called FinDev Canada, and you have a multilateral Asian infrastructure investment bank as well, which got set up around the same time, of which China is the #1 shareholder. UK and a couple of other European countries are the second biggest shareholders. I think the US actually refused to become part of the shareholding in that particular multilateral. So there's also like a geopolitics of development finance angle, which is very interesting, but a separate topic to today. I think let's flip to the next slide, which is just show you kind of what DFIs are trying to solve for, which is these various financing gaps that are commonly articulated. We have the SDG financing gap, 2.5 trillion per year. We have the climate financing gap, 2.7 trillion per year. An infrastructure financing gap, 15 trillion by 2040. If you want to capture attention, you frame it as a gap, right, and put a big dollar number against it. But the point is the big challenges, right, that DFIs are trying to chip away at. And Nick, do you want to talk about how they can try and make a dent in these challenges?
Yeah, so I start by saying, I mean, all the vast majority of people in this room are very young people. You've got your whole careers ahead of you. This area of development finance is a really, we know there's a lot going on in the whole in the aid industry. We know there's a lot of programs that have been cut and changed and refocused and whatever. I think one of the things that is relatively clear is that development finance, meaning funding private sector and encouraging private sector growth, is going to be an even more important part. So from a career perspective, I think it's a great place to be interested in looking at. I think there's those numbers speak for themselves. This huge need for capital, much of it, as I say, to be channeled through the private sector. But the questions, the really big questions, there are three really big questions, I think, for development finance institutions as they go forward. I mean, one is, how do you mobilize? I mean, we all know the institutions themselves are not big enough to solve all these problems. So how do you mobilize? How do you provide subsidy without providing too much subsidy? Or how can you provide data, or how can you provide somehow take the expertise that we have of investing in these markets and make it more available and encourage more mainstream investors to participate? So that, I think, is a critical question. I think the second one is around how you balance climate finance with development finance. And we, as I said, we became the largest provider of climate finance for the UK government, and that was true at most of all the development finance institutions have significant targets in climate finance of 30, 40, 50%. That is completely appropriate because, as I said, I think DFI should be at the sort of cutting edge of trying to address climate transition. But it also raises some issues with respect to the traditional development mandate. And certainly from my time at BII in the last 3 or 4 years, you find the pressure to do more climate does, and we know there's a huge overlap between the two, but the pressure to do more climate does push you more. Investment institutions are transactional. I mean, they're places where everybody wants to do, because you know, if you're not doing transactions, you're not really doing any. People feel they're not doing anything. So there's a natural tendency to follow in every investment institution to follow the path of least resistance, go to where the deals are easiest, lowest risk, bigger, and almost inevitably in our world of development finance, that leads you towards middle-income countries and away from lower-income countries. So I think finding that balance and also making sure that we don't lose sight of the, you know, we've still got, particularly in Africa, less, but also in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh and some of the Latin American countries, we have countries that find it almost impossible to attract capital. And successful companies in those countries find it almost impossible to attract capital. So we have to make sure that we don't lose sight of that is a fundamental role for development finance, and we can't let it become dominated by what I would say close to market transactions in large middle-income countries.
I think there's one final thing to add for me is the recent history of development finance. You can almost break it into 3 components. Pre-2010, you know, development finance was the idea that if you just invest, you're having impact, right? By purely writing a check, there is impact being developed. But what happened is, as DFIs gained more prominence and became more capitalized, there was much more scrutiny from shareholders and the taxpayer to really understand what the impact is that DFIs are having. So from 2010 to 2020, I'd say big part of the growth in the industry was on the impact side of things, right? So how can we deliver impact beyond just writing a check? So DFIs developed gender teams, climate change teams, you know, impact value creation teams, and then how can we measure as well the impact that we're having? And so DFIs became much more sophisticated in how they measure, monitor, and evaluate impact, and that itself is like an industry within an industry. But then from 2020 onwards is now, you know, about private capital mobilization. And I think, you know, if you read a lot of the literature coming out around development finance from DFIs themselves and from think tanks, it will be large, you know, a lot of it will be around private capital mobilization. But I think we'll pause there and open it to the floor for questions.
Start here.
Hi, and thank you for the talk. My name is Funke Okpeke, and I really want to ask a question about the present and maybe the future of DFIs, and I do have some experience. But I really wonder, in terms of the development label, what portion of financing in these markets come from DFIs, or have DFIs become just another lender to private enterprise in emerging markets? Is the financing really pivotal or impactful in driving development? And some of the successful examples you gave were 20 years or older. Has there been real impact in the past 20 years in some of these emerging markets, just in terms of real examples that you could provide? Because I really think the role has shifted from the original intent and examples you gave that may have been pivotal in those economies. And the role today of DFIs in some of these markets are less clear. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, I would argue that the role of development finance is even more important today than it was in the past. It has changed. It has evolved. You have to be very, and I made this point about making sure we don't allow, for example, the climate agenda to basically cannibalize or move our focus away from lower income countries. But I think it depends a lot on on the country in which you're investing. Look, if somebody comes to me, well, okay, now if I'm going to compare an investment, someone will come with a proposal to do a renewable energy project in Vietnam, for example, versus a renewable energy project in Sierra Leone. Okay, they're both renewable energy projects. They both require capital, but you look at Vietnam today, rapidly growing economy, rapidly growing banking system, attractive to international investors. I think it's really reasonable to ask, why is development finance, why is government, because all the development finance, ultimately these institutions are owned by government, so it's ultimately taxpayers' money. And I think there are some real questions to be asked about what you see with some of the institutions is some of their larger transactions. India is another place where, you know, we 10, 15 years ago, there were good reasons to do development finance in India. It's a lot more difficult to make, even though still there are more people living below the poverty line in India than any other country in the world. But they do have access to capital. They have the money to, you know, create a space program. They have a money to spend, some of them to spend $500 million on their weddings. So you know, you got to really ask, but that's very different from Sierra Leone. Okay, in Sierra Leone, there is no availability of capital. There is no domestic capital market. If there is, the sub-Saharan African area is done. When you look at the infrastructure that's being built, when you look at how the banks and financial institutions are funded, because a lot of what DFIs do is they fund financial institutions to on-lend into the, you know, small and medium-sized enterprise. All that comes today from development finance institutions. So I think it's in those countries, it's still absolutely critical.
Thank you. Given the U.S. withdraw the Paris Agreement and the Trump administration cut off all the fundings from the U.S. aid, on the other hand, China still play a very active role in this game, especially like AIIB and other policy banks. So do you think if this situation goes long, will that impact the structure of the game of the climate finance, also the development finance? Thank you.
Yeah. So I can start off with that one. Absolutely, the development finance landscape is changing, and one of the key changes that's happening is that, you know, it's no longer the narrow definition of ODA-funded Western DFIs investing in emerging markets, right? You actually have more and more prominent global south to south flows, right? And you see that in two ways. You see that in the establishment of new multilaterals, right? You know, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, BRICS, New Development Bank. You have the African Finance Corporation that was founded in 2017, which is funded by African countries themselves, and you know they're taking a much more prominent role. And then the other key player is national development banks, right? So national development banks are becoming a key kind of tool for governments to finance their domestic industrial policy. And that's where what you're seeing now happen is just as politically the world is becoming more multipolar, it's happening within the development finance ecosystem as well. I personally think it's a good thing. You know, you need that diversity of flows, especially the more south to south flows we can see. But, you know, as I said, depending on where those flows originate from and go to and what they're financing, there is, you know, some geopolitical aspect to it as well.
I'd say, I think the decisions that this current administration are making around withdrawing from aid, and which is an enormous sort of geopolitical strategic error, and it's because it is ceding I spent 7 years traveling around Africa and Asia, meeting with governments, and so I know how they value the support, not all the support, but much of the support they were getting, and it creates a sort of a soft power. It creates influence. I think stepping back from that, and it's not just, by the way, the US. The US obviously were the most dramatic with their evisceration of USAID, but the British the UK have stepped back and cut their ODA spending. The Germans have done that. The French have done that. Together, those four, I think, account for 70% of ODA. So this is, I think, a huge geopolitical mistake that we will. And whatever you think about the Chinese, I think we do need to maintain our influence in these countries. So I think it's a huge mistake.
Okay, thank you. And this is Chun. I'm from MPID 1, and I have one question regarding the monitoring and evaluation system, which has been mentioned about the impact measurements of the development finance. And I have been curious in learning because when I think about the development finance institution, they are at the upstream industry levels, but how do you manage the impact? How do you manage the knowledge that you have accumulated throughout the development financing experiences in the past year?
So I think that one of the things that we did at BII when I was there was, I guess, identify as a number of other DFIs did over the last decade, identify the fact that we needed a much clearer framework for how we think about our impact. And it wasn't just a question of any money that goes into these countries is good enough. And so we did, and actually there's a Harvard Business School case on how we developed this, which they launched last year. But we tried to, I think it starts with having a framework. If we went back to BII sort of, I guess, 7 or 8 years ago, we were having a lot of discussions in investment committees. And I think the financial discussion is fairly straightforward. It's not that different from a normal commercial organization. The impact discussion is much more complex, and obviously different people see different value in different things. And I think what we felt was essential was to create a framework that gave us some guidance. And we looked at broadly at 3 different areas, each investment under 3 different criteria. One was what we call productivity, which was how did it increase productivity and economic growth in the country? How did it create jobs? So on. The second one was inclusion, particularly how it reached disadvantaged groups in some of these countries, poor communities, women. So we scored them for that. And then sustainability, which was a function of how it contributed or affected the climate transition in those countries. So that's sort of a very short overview of what is a pretty complex system. There's a Harvard Business School case you can look at. There's and lots of documentation on the BII website. But I think it was quite transformational in the sense that it's not perfect. No system is going to be perfect, but it did give us this framework and something to benchmark against.
And on the evaluation side, there's actually quite a bit of an ecosystem of like firms out there that do evaluation work on DFI and their investments and what impact they're having. I actually am working on one of those such evaluation programs myself, and they, they're usually funded by the shareholder of these organizations, because it's really, really important to know, are they getting value for money? What is the impact that these organizations are having, both on the positive side and the negative side? And so that's quite an ecosystem that's grown and built up over the last few years.
I think we can take 2 questions at a time.
Right.
So I'll start in the back.
Thank you, professors. My question, we talked a little bit about present and the future. I wanted to step back a bit to discuss the past and kind of follow up on your initial discussion about what's the not so rosy picture about DFIs. You discussed about, some of the investments that might have not been working. And this is obviously very typical of investments. Some worked, some didn't. but I wanted a little bit more. I wanted to know a little bit more if you've seen some of the externalities, so negative externalities that comes from probably economically successful, investments from DFIs. If we've seen that, and for the goal of not repeating or not, avoiding doing the same things, given that there is, as you mentioned, large gaps in financing still. That would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, should I take another one?
Thank you. By virtue of the sort of unique makeup of DFIs and the use of public funds, I wonder if the sort of regulatory framework impedes the involvement of private capital, I think particularly of sort of public procurement rules, and whether that increase in friction in the process and the requirement to go out to tender and re-tender prevents private capital from being inclined to invest.
Yeah. Okay, shall I
can take the second one, the easy one. But the DFIs aren't structured as departments of the government, and therefore they're not subject to the same rules. So DFIs are like typically, a part of what makes a DFI and what is you need a degree of independence from the government, and that's achieved by having the DFI in a separate corporation. It could be wholly owned, and it often is by the shareholder, by the government, but there's a legal separation. And in terms of what that means is because the DFI operates as a company, it, for me working there, it was a nice mix between, the mission of being public capital trying to do good, but yet sort of to some degree the speed and flexibility and innovation of a private sector organization. And so when it comes to engaging with the private sector on deals and on contracts, there aren't those public procurement rules that apply.
It does depend, or country by country, and what Wasim is describing is true of the UK. So we were an independent company with an independent board. We had one shareholder, and that shareholder was the UK government. So we were sitting outside that government sort of outside those government procurement rules. That's not true in every country. I mean, France, for example, Proparco, which is our equivalent in France, sits within AFD, which is part of the French government. So it does vary in different countries, but certainly if you have to, for those organizations that have to subscribe to government things like government procurement rules, it definitely makes the job more difficult. So on the externalities question, yeah, look, I think that's every investment has externalities, positive and negative. That has been true for a long time. There's no doubt, and I referenced this when I went in some of the examples I gave, that particularly in a couple of areas, environmental externalities. I mean, we've been building, cement factories and all sorts of other highly emissive facilities for a long period of time. We've been until 2014, the DFI community has always been actively involved in power infrastructure through PPPs, was building fossil fuel power generation in multiple countries. We stopped that in 2014. There's a lot of that. There has definitely been some of that, and there's been, and then I think there's a lot of community engagement and issues related, particularly when you think about things like hydropower, agriculture, small-scale farming, that type of thing, land issues, where I think in the past the development finance community was perhaps not as engaged as they should have been. But I would say that has changed enormously. I mean, in my time in VII, the impact group, which is the group that thinks about what are the development impacts we're going to have, what are the positive and negative externalities, what are the environmental, social, and governance issues. I mean, that group grew from 10 people to 100 people or something. So it's a much bigger part, to some extent, it creates some issues. I mean, you find very little DFI money now going into manufacturing, because almost any particularly in countries in Africa and places like Pakistan, and it's very difficult to meet your environmental targets. There is a bit of a balance here, but I think we're much better at it than we used to be.
taking our last question. So
Take it in. We'll take two.
Hello, my name is Assam and I'm an MPID 1 student. You mentioned that some of the developing countries kind of find it hard to mobilize capital in development finance institution. And I was wondering if it's one of the primary reasons could be the regulatory environment and regulatory challenges in these countries. Because I've worked from the regulatory side for like 4 years, and one of the feedbacks that we have received over and over again is that there is stringent regulatory requirements. I just wanted to know what's the experience like in the UK.
Yeah, we take one more.
So hi, my name is Varun. My question is basically how do DFIs sort of approach systems level change, right? Or systems level investment. So we can think of investments in like particular projects or particular companies, but we know that systemic impact can also be generated at like multiple levels in different ways. So is there a framework for thinking about that? And as a second part of that question, how do sort of traditional banks like the JP Morgans of the world, right? How do they approach social sector investments versus DFIs, which are like meant for this kind of work? So is there a particular difference between them? And is there a convergence or divergence between those two things? Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I can tackle the first one. So I think the three kind of big challenges for channeling private capital into emerging markets. I think one is absolutely, what's the regulatory and legal environment, and how sophisticated is it within a particular country context, right? Because if it's not so well developed, or if it's quite volatile, then private capital won't have the confidence to come in and invest. That's first and foremost. And secondly is key barrier is the currency risk, the forex risk, right? Because you might invest in private capital might find an attractive investment opportunity, a great business model, right? It could be a port, it could be a commercial bank. But if they know that there's going to be huge depreciation, or the likelihood of depreciation of the currency is quite high, then that's just going to eat away any returns that they're able to generate. And I think thirdly, and this is just a fact of the way the asset management industry is in, like, say, the US, the UK, Germany, is that there are some fiduciary restrictions on the types of countries that they can invest in, and that's based on the investment grade, how investment grade or not the country sovereign rating is. Right, and I think that's a key limitation. So a lot of institutional investors just cannot have exposure directly to certain markets, and that's just a very, very intractable problem to try and solve for.
Yeah, I think it's broadly it's around the broad investment climate, and that a part of that is obviously regulatory challenges, ease of doing business, those type of things. But the investment climate, the key elements of the investment climate are, as Wasim said, the macroeconomic environment. I was almost 8 years as the chief executive of BII. We invested basically in Africa and South Asia. In that 8-year period, there was only one country of all those countries of any significance that didn't experience a major macroeconomic or political crisis. And that almost inevitably led to massive devaluations of their currency. And so it's very difficult to mobilize, meaning attract foreign capital in those circumstances. And we can use things like blended finance and guarantees and so on to a point. But this fundamental issue around investment climate, investability is critical. Regulation, by the way, I think when we talk about banks, honestly, I think we found the regulatory environment, it's not perfect, but from an investment perspective, it wasn't a constraint to getting things done, certainly in that sector. On the question of systemic change, it's a great question. I mean, it is true that DFIs we are transactional, and it's very difficult to and you're judged by volumes, whether you like it or not. I mean, and so it's sometimes difficult to focus. Creating systemic change, I think, requires more focus on individual sectors and individual sectors within countries, and some of the and clustering investments more so that you can. That is a hard. I think we try to do that, but I wouldn't say with some success, but not.
I think actually my first role was at BII was an attempt to try and do just that, because I came on board as what you call a sector strategist for financial institutions, and it was to wrap a strategy around how we can use investments in financial institutions to do financial sector development. But trying to marry that top down with what is fundamentally an investment house that does transactions, it's tough. It's tough, and also you need a sufficient amount of scale to be able to do that. And so the multilaterals are probably better at trying to do that than the bilaterals.
Yeah, I think a question on banks, specifically I'll answer JP Morgan, because that's where I have some experience of. I think, to a large extent, international, if we talk about the hardest places, so Africa particularly, and then some of the hard countries in South Asia, like Pakistan. I mean, to a large extent, the international banks are now absent from those markets. They're absent because capital constraints are too high. They're absent because the compliance costs are enormous, and there just isn't sufficient business. So I think if you think broadly, as I said, I got into this by getting involved with the creation of the social sector finance group at JP Morgan, and I know that was Jamie who pushed that idea. It was his sort of baby, along with the managing director who set it up, and so I know that in that particular institution, you have a chief executive who really does believe that banks have a role, that banks obviously are financial institutions and commercial institutions, but they have an important role to play in communities. And I think there's lots of evidence around the United States and other places where they're doing that. But at the same time, they don't have the capacity. The reason DFIs exist is because JP Morgan may just opening an office in Lagos and Nairobi, but realistically, they're not going to be doing. They have a fiduciary responsibility, I suppose, and they're not going to be doing the sort of things that a BII can do. Although I will finish by saying that JP Morgan is the only major bank that has set up what they call a DFI. Now, it's a rather different animal from what we think of as a DFI, but I think they should be applauded for doing that. And I think by trying to more consciously assess the impact of the investments or some of the financing the bank is doing. I think that's a very positive development, and they've just done some very good work on that.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Wasim and Nick, for your time. Feel free.
Thank you.
Please remember that all food items, including cups, napkins, and utensils, are compostable. Save the environment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I'm here now in around basically the rest for a year. So I'll try to, for those of you, I know there's a lot of interest in the sector, and so I'll be doing office hours and stuff. So if you want to come and see me, feel free to do that.
Nick?